ahead and hand it off to you, and I'll be here kind of monitoring the chat. Let me know if you guys have any questions. And yeah.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're a small group at the moment, a select group, but here we are. We're also, just so you know, we're still waiting for one of our colleagues. Kathleen Collins will be joining us as soon as she can. Something came up and she's on her way. So the topic is why it matters, academic integrity and the education for justice. So let me, if I may, let me just say a little bit about where this panel discussion came from. I know I've heard from some of you who are here already. There's so much concern about ChatGPT. There's so much swirling around about how knowledge is being disseminated, how it's being reproduced, what constitutes authenticity in academia and outside. Where the semester is about to start, we're all looking for guidance. What are we going to do? How are we going to go about this? And fortunately, including at this very FDD day, there are panels with suggestions. There are resources out there. We're all researching. We're all looking. We're waiting for CUNY to give us guidance. But in the meantime, perhaps we thought this was the opportunity for us to take some perspective as to what constitutes academic integrity, what authenticity looks like in this changing landscape, where we are so we can figure out where the heck we're going, so that when we get direction from above, we have a perspective to do something with it, something that's authentic to your roles as instructors. Because if we're confused, what do we expect from our students? So that's where this came from. In fact, our original title for this posed it as a question: does it matter? So what we envisioned for this panel today was that we, my library colleagues and I, would share from our different perspectives. Whoop, here comes Kathleen. Would share from our different perspectives what kinds of things we're seeing from students as they're working through your classrooms, what kind of issues are arising, what kinds of trends and patterns we're seeing. We thought that we might bring a slightly different perspective because, after all, we're not faculty, directly speaking. We're not in the classroom. We're the third point of the triangle. We don't even have necessarily the same perspectives of each other. But we're entering into this conversation of student work at different points. And we thought if we shared some of the experiences we've been having, what we see emerging, it might help to promote some reflection as to where you are when you think about academic integrity and how best to share it with your students. So that's my preamble. We were thinking about this as taking perspective. So that's our plan for today. We're going to talk for a little bit. We're going to share what we think we have to share, and then we're going to ask you to talk with us. And that's how we hope to proceed. So, Marta, you want to jump in?
Sure. I'm Marta Blarek from the library. And the reason why Kathleen and I approached Jennifer with an idea for the FDD is that one of the questions of academic authenticity and the research integrity came up in Gina's call for proposals, but also it struck me that we in the library and Jennifer interact with those issues at a very different moment in students' process, right? Meaning here in the library, we are mostly encountering students who are working or close to finishing the research papers, projects, presentations, and so on. Whereas Jennifer is contending with academic integrity issues at the end of the spectrum, after the work has been submitted, after it has been evaluated and graded by the faculty member and has been found problematic in one way or another. So not knowing exactly all the array of cases, and I'm hoping to hear more about that from Jennifer. Kathleen and I wanted to touch on some of the points that touch on academic integrity as far as we see it here in the library. And we talked about that as our pet peeves, right? What we have seen repeatedly, what keeps coming up in one version or one another. And we thought of organizing them kind of chronologically, right? So I'll start with mine, my problem, so to say, which very often happens to be the requirements that students start their research project with a concrete set research thesis, right? So very often before they're expected to be reading around, to be doing some thinking, to have looked at sources, having evaluated information, students are asked, what is your research thesis right now for the paper that is due 2 months from now, right? As a librarian, as somebody who is aware of how difficult and how challenging and how complex the research process is, that emphasis that very often makes students very uncomfortable and feel very iffy about the whole idea of doing research, calls up the question of what is authentic research? What counts as engaging in intellectual inquiry? I guess what I'm saying is that really in the interest of our students developing critical skills, thinking through the information they encounter, clarifying things through writing, through completing those kinds of assignments? Is it really something that serves them the best? The idea that they start off with a clear idea, clear point, clear argument, that's a given at the beginning of the research process, right? The other kind of related pet peeve that I've seen time and time again, and it shows up and comes up slightly differently, but the one major aspect of it looks something like this. At the reference desk, we have a lovely student who says, guess what? I need some help. I'm writing this research paper. I know what I'm saying. These are the arguments I've been making. This is what I'm arguing. So now I need sources that prove that I'm right, right? Like just find me references that would exactly repeat what I already have said in my paper. It comes up a lot. And it also appears to be something that students often assume is the correct way of doing research. They try very hard, and I understand it, to document and find evidence for their arguments, right? Which is exactly what we like to emphasize. However, the dynamic and the thinking behind finding evidence, once again, to me, calls into question how is research in that kind of form done authentically? Is the assignment as interpreted, as done by the student, is it achieving its objective to give a student a taste of exploring ideas, engaging with arguments, and tackling some of the intellectual debates that they may encounter if they move beyond the conception of a research paper as a listing of sources and evidence that proves and shows that their way of thinking is really legit. Okay? And I think now Kathleen has her own problematic part of the research cycle.
Oh, you can always count on me to have peeves at the ready. So yeah, as along the lines of here's what we encounter in the library, I'm going to raise two scenarios that we see all the time. One is that students come to the desk, as Marta said, even more egregious than what she described. They come saying, I have already completed my paper. Now I would like the sources. That's the worst of it. And this is not a rare occurrence. Related to that, and so what I'm addressing here related to academic integrity is probably the most concrete manifestation of academic integrity, which is the citations. So they come to the desk, they say, I've written my paper, I want my citations. But even if they are doing things in the right order and they come to the desk and say, I need help with my citations, or I don't understand citations, or whatever, that's fine. That's what we're here for. But what we encounter is a lot of fear and jitteriness. I make no assumptions about what classroom faculty are doing in terms of talking about citation, but and it may not be happening in that classroom. It may be the culture of citation is very much tied to the word plagiarism. So there's a lot of fear about if I don't do this right, I will be accused of plagiarism. And B, sometimes they say, oh, my professor is really, really picky about this, and she's going to get so mad if I have the quotation marks in the wrong place or the wrong, and they're very worried about the formatting. And so my mantra about this whole citation business is that there's too much focus on how instead of why. And yes, we would love students to have, especially me, I'm a stickler for correct grammar and correct placement of commas in the citation, but leaving out the how is leaving out the why is a really big mistake, because that's where the fear just fills the gap. And the how is, this, but we have to get this across to students. Why do I care about my citations? 1, to give credit where credit is due. 2 is to help subsequent researchers. The subsequent researchers reading your paper or your article or your book will say, where'd you get that? How do you know that? I'd like to follow up on that. And so it's not even really just a matter of making sure they can find it because the citation is formatted properly. In the olden days, that was a huge problem. If you had the wrong journal number, a researcher could go literally insane trying to find it. Today, the internet helps us find even poorly written citations, but it's still helping the subsequent researcher see, well, where's this article and what other articles can I get from it too? It's part of that whole building of the scholarly conversation. And then, of course, the third reason is so that you aren't accused of plagiarism, so that you cite so that to me is the bottom of the list, the plagiarism part of it. All 3 of those things, though, equal academic integrity and authenticity and learning. If you haven't done, the student, have not done those steps of looking at what came before you, looking for that evidence to back up your own argument, you're skipping the knowledge gaining, the learning, and that's inauthentic and lacking in integrity. So this is how it is directly tied to this theme of academic integrity. So it shows you've done the legwork and gives you credibility as the author of this thing. So that's from what we see with the students come to the reference desk. What we also hear very, very often is we get requests from faculty members saying, please come visit my class, or let me come to the classroom and have a librarian lead a session for me. And, we might say, well, what's the, what would you like to get out of the session? What's your need? I would say way more than 65% of the time, the answer is AP citation. That's the total sum of the interaction, AP citation. And I say, well, that'll take 3 seconds. What do you really want? And I actually don't really care what they say. I just know what they need. So I tell them everything I just said before, all of those things, why we cite and why it's important. And then the how is, oh, the library has a bunch of guides for APA, MLA, Chicago. So you just copy the style. You fit, you know, here's the author, here's the title. If that's all you're focused on, then of course the student's going to be scared, because some people aren't good at that detail-oriented stuff. They don't see the importance of it. They may not do it properly, and then they'll get points off on their paper, and the whole point is lost. And so that's my main point. But as we were planning this session, you know, Marta brought something up that I think is really interesting that I haven't thought through myself, but related to the other AI, artificial intelligence. We already use so many tools that we didn't have before, and citation creation is one of them. You've all seen these easy bib type websites, and every database has a button that says cite, so you don't have to do any work. You just click cite and it magically makes the citation for you. I use them all the time. I promote the use of them all the time. I always warn students and faculty, you got to proofread them, because there's mistakes in you know, a huge percentage of them. They may be small mistakes, but you can't just let the machine do it for you. So isn't this analogous to what we think of about these? I'm going to say Chat GPT because I can't remember the generic name for the whole thing. Is it large language
models? Yeah.
So, okay. You know, so some people might say, well, that's exactly what we're planning on doing with ChatGPT. It's a place to start. It's like, let's give them the base, and then they can go in and futz with it and fix it. You know, that's how some people are planning on dealing with it. And it's hard to argue when we say, well, that's what we're doing with the citation makers too. You know, there's a degree of, I'll be dramatic and say morality. But I have no problem with the citation maker thing, mainly because what I think is the important part of the citation is everything I said before, which is why we do it. Getting the citation there is the important thing. If you're going to quote unquote cheat a little bit with how you get it, okay, in this case, but I don't know if students will be able to necessarily see that nuance so clearly. So I leave that question for all of you, what you think about the authenticity of the citation makers, but also it's just my opportunity to harp on one of my favorite pet peeves, which is, just to recap, the students coming to the desk and saying, I already wrote my paper, how do I cite? What can I cite? Them being terrified of doing it incorrectly, and then faculty saying, hi, librarian, show my students APA citation. And then it's much, much larger than that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll swing into my part of the story. I'm going to start in a more general way by talking about some current trends, and then give a few scenarios that might illustrate that. So, you know, there's this sense out there that the pandemic broke us all, which is certainly true in many, many ways, but that it changed and people are cheating more than ever, and they're doing this more than ever, and they're doing that more than ever. And it's still a moving target, so it's hard to tell if that's really true. But let me give you some very simple descriptive stats. So last year, this past academic year, fall 2022 through today, I received 63 formal reports of academic integrity violations. Now that's just, Maria's shaking her head. Are you stunned? That's actually, it's higher than it's been during the pandemic, but it's not as high as it's been in the past. And again, that only represents what was formally reported to me as the academic integrity officer. It does not reflect those issues that were resolved between instructor or student, or those that just for whatever reason never saw the light of day. But on paper, 63 reported cases last year. What's interesting about it is that usually the pattern is that there are more reports in the spring than there are in the fall, because unfortunately, the highest demographics are graduating seniors who lose their minds before they graduate and do all kinds of things they're not supposed to do. My other top demographics, FYI, are transfer students who come from places that don't take the same stance towards academic integrity than we do. What's interesting about this spring was that actually I had a lower percentage of formal reports coming in. I had and am still receiving those from the summer, but where I did see a dramatic increase was in informal faculty consultation. Generally speaking, I do informal consultations with faculty maybe 45. During the pandemic was high. I had 51 academic integrity informal faculty consultations about concerns. During the fall of 2019, the spring of 2020, and I had 55 the following year. And then it dropped down as we kind of came back, quote unquote, to normal. But in the spring alone, I have held almost 60 informal faculty consultations. Not all of them resulted in informal reports that could be acted on, but there's clearly a lot of concern out there. The interesting thing is that quite a few of them did have to do with suspicions, concerns, worries about GPT. But there was no follow-up because we are all feeling a lack of direction. Interestingly, this summer, which summer is usually very dead for me because the sessions are so short. Instructors really don't have the time to do the paperwork before the class is over, but I've received 10 reports this summer. That is very unusual, and I've been doing this for 10 years now. And I would say that 6 out of the 10 seem to suggest some ChatGPT concerns. So it's taking a while. The fear of ChatGPT and the like, the concerns about it have been percolating for 2 years. But the actual formal expression of those concerns by our faculty is taking longer. And that's no big surprise. Other trends is that since the pandemic, plagiarism and the old-fashioned failure to cite properly, can't do APA kind of thing is still as present as it ever was pre-pandemic, pre-chat GPT. What did take a huge jump over the pandemic was cheating in the form of inappropriate collaboration, people getting together to do things together that they were supposed to do independently. Now, for me, just as scary, if not as scary as ChatGPT, is the way that our students are using social media, and more specifically, the kind of ambivalence that we feel about it. Students are taking advantage of social media platforms like WhatsApp to create study groups. What a wonderful thing. They collaborate together. They groove on each other. The only problem is they don't cut it off when they're in the exam. And before you know it, we're cheating. So it takes very, very, just one question from one frightened student to another to create a cascade event. That's something that we haven't addressed because we don't know how. We don't really have a mechanism for dealing with 20 cheating students at one time in one class, other than for me to go in and do sort of a crisis intervention for an instructor when he or she begs me to. So it's easy to take ChatGPT as the sign of the apocalypse, but the truth is all these trends have been percolating for quite some time. And the way we're learning is changing, and the way we're teaching is changing. And so we've got to really think about what we think as instructors constitutes academic integrity in our classroom, because the guidance is going to be evolving. And that leads me to I'm going to jump to my third point, the big picture, because basically what a lot of us are looking for is guidance from above, from outside. What does CUNY tell us to do? I wish I had a dime for every time someone has asked me that this month. CUNY was working under the same academic integrity policy for a decade, unchanged, from 2011 to fall of 2022. In fall 2022, they revised it to reflect the fact that, there are places like Course Hero. There are places where students can download entire essays. We better address that. So they did a little patch correction, and all the academic integrity officers in CUNY said, no, 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 not enough, not enough. So as we speak, CUNY is working on revising the academic integrity policy to reflect artificial intelligence. That has not been published yet. We don't really quite know how far along they are with it, but hopefully it'll be published soon. So that's the CUNY policy, and that will tell us what CUNY's stance is towards this. As a sneak preview, their stance is that unless it's authorized by the instructor, the use of artificial intelligence to generate your work and the submission of that generated work to fulfill a class assignment is both cheating, and if you don't acknowledge that you got it from ChatGPT, plagiarism. That's the stance they're taking. How we're going to reconcile that with the school of thought that says, well, gee, this is the wave of the future, we better figure out what to do with it, remains to be seen. But that's the stance that we anticipate CUNY is going to give us. But a policy is just a policy. It's not an implementation. And one of the things that many instructors working here are not aware of is that John Jay does not actually have a specific academic integrity policy. What you see when you click on a link that says a John Jay policy is merely a reproduction of the outdated academic integrity policy. The CUNY policy gives every college the right to tailor within their guidelines their own policy. This time in which we are living could be the perfect time for us to craft what we think academic integrity is about and how it looks for our students. This is big picture stuff, and I'm happy to say that our upper leadership is starting to have those conversations, is actively working on these issues. Our wonderful IT people are working with CUNY on exploring the tools that might catch things like the kind of detectors that catch plagiarism for artificially written materials. These things are all happened, but here you are with classes to teach now. And what are you supposed to do? Well, Angela Crossman has recently updated what the model syllabus reflects in terms of ChatGPT. And I strongly recommend, if you haven't seen it, to check that out, because that should be part of your syllabus, just like the boilerplate plagiarism stuff, academic integrity stuff is on your syllabus. But I also would suggest that boilerplate language is not enough. And that too, was the impetus for us wanting to have this particular discussion in this particular way. Students need to know not just what the boilerplate is, because they don't always apply that to what they're doing. They need to know what you think. So one of our lab instructors has become very, very, very specific. She not only includes the boilerplate language in her syllabus, she actually spells out what constitutes what in her class. So if you collaborate on a lab assignment, if you collaborate on any assignment other than those specifically designated as a group assignment, we consider that cheating. Now, do students always abide by that? Well, no, some do, some don't, most do. But if they don't, it makes it easier for you as the instructor to point them in the right direction. And it makes your stance perfectly clear. And it is within the academic integrity policy in any iteration. So one of the things that I would suggest, now I'm looping back to my second point, resolution pathways, is to be so clear in your communications with your students about what you expect, what you think it constitutes cheating and plagiarism in your class. And of course, then there's the difficult conversations you need to have when the bad things happen. And this is where I can be helpful if you're unsure as to how to proceed. Because what it has to be about is about the work, not about the student and not about you. And that's the other reason to be really clear about your expectations. I have learned in my doing this work so much about my presuppositions about what other people think, about what they think is right and wrong. It leads me, if I'm not careful, to make attributions to their actions, which are unwarranted and frankly beside the point. So you don't have to get involved with intentions. You don't have to sit and judge a student and their soul. All you have to do is look at their work, have the right conversations to understand their work, especially when there's a concern about it, and then proceed accordingly. Oh, I'm on my soapbox now. I think that's pretty much everything that I can share in this particular context. At this point, I think we had planned to move to a discussion. I don't want to put Maria and Ellis on the spot, but I will if they're willing to talk.
And Judy Lynn is here too.
Is she? I'm sorry, I don't see her on my screen. I thought she'd left. I'm sorry, Judy Lynn. I apologize.
I'm here.
Yay, Judy Lynn.
Quietly.
Actually, I was hoping you were still here because can I put you on the spot?
Sure.
Because Judy Lynn has been in touch with me, particularly about your 700 level classes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I were to ask you without thinking about the boilerplate, without thinking about the college, when I say academic integrity to you, what do you think? What comes to your mind?
I think of integrity. I think of honesty, because the students in our program are going to go out and become confidential investigators. They're going to be people doing oversight and investigation. And many of our students are already in that line of work. And so it's really, really important that we begin to develop a culture of honesty and integrity and accountability. I think from the get-go. The 700 course is the first course in the graduate program, and we're trying to set a standard that they'll carry through the rest of the 14 classes, but also carry into the profession, because when they go out into the world and get jobs, they carry our name. And we've already had examples of recruiters coming to us and saying, well, your students don't write well, or your students need to do this more. And the last thing I want to hear is your student got arrested because, you know, he was dishonest. So to my thinking, it's something that I want to engage students in talking about, and building a culture of this is how you go about learning, and this is how you go about using information. And I think what's happening right now in politics and in criminal justice system is showing us the consequences of not having integrity and not being accountable. So I think this is really important. So one of the things I want to do this semester is engage all of my classes online and on campus in discussions about integrity, honesty, accountability, responsibility, and alongside that, what it takes to be a good scholar and how to work on that. If you aren't competent in your writing, if you aren't competent in your research ability, here are the resources. As I talked to Maria this morning, go to the librarian and ask for help, you know, instead of thinking that, oh, the answer is to just go find the answer online and fake it till you make it.
You know, one of our colleagues in philosophy, thank you, that was wonderful, because you touched on so many things that I would ideally have liked, that I would like to ask faculty at this point in time. One of our faculty in philosophy uses, instead of using patch plagiarism, which is probably the biggest kind of plagiarism I see these days, you know, that's where some of it is from an external source, some of it is the student or some, and it's all jumbled together, so you can't tell when it, he uses, instead of patch plagiarism, he uses the phrase mosaic plagiarism. And one of the, I know it's beautifully poetic, but it's also very telling, because I think, speaking to what Kathleen and Marta and you have referenced now, this idea of what constitutes research and some students believe that they're actually, when they take from here and take from there and they smush it together, like they're building something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it does loop back to a lack of training in terms of the philosophy behind research and what it's meant to do. You know, and I think if we could find a way to really get that across to the students way, way earlier, way before they're at the 700 level, certainly way before they're doing their capstone classes,
yeah,
that a lot, not only would that aspect of things be greatly reduced, the students would more easily feel that connection between honesty, integrity, and authenticity. Because that's the other point that Judy Lynn touched on so beautifully, was you did my heavy lifting for me. You made the connection to our mission, educating for social justice, in that way. You know, because I just came from, I don't know if any of you were at the lunch, not the lunch, the about student conduct and, you know, de-escalating problematic students and whatnot. But it was all about, it was called, I have to yell to be heard. And what I tell students when they meet with me is that being authentic, doing your research with integrity, giving credit where credit is due, so people can see where you start and how you've built on what's already there. That's your voice. That's your connection. And that's what gives your work value and meaning, let alone the implications for professional accreditation, which is also very, very, very clear. Yeah.
So I was going to comment that even though in our presentation we are focusing on students, as we know, research integrity touches on all of the stakeholders in higher ed, right? So research fraud, research misconduct. If I remember correctly, a study I read, it's actually happening a lot among senior scholars and researchers, right? Where the stakes of getting a grant, getting lots of funding are pretty high. So it's the questions we're dealing with are not just for the classroom. And I think in our conversations before today with Jennifer and Kathleen, we also wanted to touch on that and have faculty who are practicing scholars reflect on their own practices and their own approaches in which they adhere to research integrity, right? And one of the things when I was thinking of it that came up for me was my experience as an editorial assistant in scholarly journals. And the question, I think, was inspired by one of the cases that Jennifer referred to. Jennifer, I can briefly mention that because it was very interesting. So Jennifer was recalling a case she had at some point about a student who was not a native language speaker, who completed an assignment in her or their native language, and then fed it into Google Translate and submitted it in English to the teaching instructor, right? And the question was like, was it acceptable? Was it not a legit way to handle that? You know, and I think, Jennifer, we were dealing with more than one possible answers, right? For me, it brought up an experience I had as an editorial assistant who was charged with cleaning up and editing a very well-established scholar's paper. Well, I have to say, the person whose paper I was editing was widely published. The paper I was dealing with was not in any way readable or easy to comprehend. And it was my job behind the scene to clean it up and make it presentable, so to speak. So I kept thinking how, you know, Grammarly, ChatGPT, that's on one end. On the other hand, those of us who were blessed to work with wonderful editors, we've already benefited from writing assistance that was provided to us as a part of the academic publishing cycle, right? So I think another thing that I also wonder that's been coming up and I've been hearing people refer to is it the end of the research paper as we know it? Now that ChatGPT is there, you know, and I'm thinking maybe it is the end and maybe it's not too bad because again, what is the learning objective, the learning outcome? Do we really want to just see the final product? And if that's the case, maybe the students who come in and say, like, I just need my citations, I have it already, I plug something in, I'm good to go. Maybe they understand it and maybe they're right. Or is the product, or is it what we're after as educator is what Judy Lynn was talking about? Like, you know, getting students to understand the process, the reasons for doing certain things, the conventions, and also how that work factors in your relationship with coworkers, with different stakeholders, and the mission and responsibility of the professional role you have.
Yeah. It's funny about that particular case of mine that you referenced in terms of it actually has happened more than once that an instructor has said that there's something off about this paper, there's something off about this paper. And in speaking and deal with the student, yes, it was run through Google Translate or something like that to clean it up and perfect. And interestingly enough, in every case, the instructor responded to me, then I want to drop it. I want to drop it. I want to drop the case. I don't want to go forward with this, because if that's what they did, well, then they did what they felt they needed to do. There has never been any reference, as I say, in the CUNY policy as to how things like Grammarly, Google Translate are to be used. I mean, of course, there have been cases in foreign language classes here where someone used Google Translate, and that was blatantly cheating because their job was to translate. And, so, but we don't have a firm stance on that because it kind of depends. So a lot of our concerns, the fear about ChatGPT, actually is sort of embedded in the way that in the concerns we've always had, how to get students, how important is it to follow APA? What happens when you as an instructor, I don't care what they do as long as they cite it, and then they get 3 classes later to the professor who only wants APA, and the student comes to me and says, I don't understand. I thought whatever I did, students don't understand the different rules in different classes. And of course, rightly so, we very much protect our faculty's autonomy in terms of their classroom practices, above and beyond the disciplinary differences that one would expect. The math and computer science people have very different expectations than the anthropology people do. Well, that kind of makes sense in a certain way. But what it leads to is students are either confused, or here's my cynicism after 10 years talking, they work the system. And it becomes very difficult to have these conversations. And that's part of the problem too. At this point in time, I have come to feel that really the best plagiarism checker, the best authentication of student work, there's absolutely no software in the world that's going to replace a conversation with your students, a conversation with your student. So tell me how you went about this. What was your methodology for writing this paper? Where did these ideas come from? This all sounds very wonderful, and I know what I'm saying, because if you talk to a student like that, you're going to know whether they wrote it or not, because people who actually wrote something know how to talk about what they wrote in some way, shape, or form that you can recognize. But let's be practical. How are you supposed to do that as an instructor with so many students and so little time? Judy Lynn raising her hand.
I didn't want to interrupt. One of the things I do in my classes, and again, I'm teaching graduate, and I do it at the undergraduate level, but not as much, is I make students write a term paper project worksheet so that they give me a topic and I'll ask them to answer questions about, key stakeholders or key pieces of information. And they need to demonstrate that they've done some research before they begin to write. Now, not every student does it, and they find ways around it, or they'll give me a worksheet that says one thing and try to do another. But I tell my students that I won't approve your topic until you demonstrated to me that you know the topic and that you've done enough research to be able to defend it to me as to what you're doing and why. And I think that tends to give them some confidence about what they're going to do. I think one of the reasons why students cheat or rely on resources too heavily is that they don't know what they're doing. And so they'll sit in front of a keyboard and they'll write what's in front of them. They'll take what's in front of them. Whereas if I could encourage students to do some research, gain an understanding, be able to answer some questions, once they understand something, they'll have a confidence to put it down on paper and talk about it. So to the extent you can get them to process stuff before they commit to the paper, and that's what scaffolding does so great, having students get feedback and give you a chance, give the student a chance to work out the difficulties and the questions, then the student can more confidently attempt to do a paper and rely on their own words. And one of the things I often do in my classes, if I think students are relying too heavily on resources, I just ban them from quoting anything. And it's remarkable. It sounds crazy, but
No, it sounds,
and they have to write it in their own words. And so I talk to them about when you read something, summarize it, and then write from what you've summarized, write from your understanding rather from what the reading says. And they don't necessarily write great, but you can tell the difference. It's their own stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I
So
mean,
Judy Lynn,
sorry.
yeah, I think the English department folks explained to me that what you just described is pretty much the difference between asking students for a report versus an inquiry-based assignment, right? Because if it's just summing up and bringing up everything from the source, where are you in the process besides just summing up? Yeah, I always found it like very useful in distinguishing these two. Yeah.
Yeah, and students definitely have a really, really hard time understanding how to even use quotes anyway. They just don't understand that a whole paragraph of their paper shouldn't be, just because it's in quotations, everything's fine. Like, that's just a really sophisticated skill that seems so obvious to us, but they need a lot of help with that. And I just wanted to go back to Ellis's comment in the chat. I don't know if Jennifer saw it, but she happened to
Sorry. Yeah.
she sort of addressed it ESP, even if she didn't see it, because that was Jennifer's point, even before she, just a few minutes ago when she said the one of the goals here in this moment in time is to figure out where you as an instructor stand on all of this and convey that clearly to your students, because that's all you can do right now. There is no, you should do this, you should do that. We just have to be in the moment, and there's value to having the classroom be a discipline. Ellis talks about a specific thing in the chat about computer programming. And yeah, maybe in computer programming, it's cool to do this and that and the other. And maybe in sociology you can do that. But what about the classroom here today? What about Judy Lynn's class? This is what the policy is going to be here. This is how we're going to deal with this. And to make this whole thing that we're talking about a conversation with students is so valuable. It isn't just for us to talk about here and trickle down. It's for us to talk about with them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it also loops back. And Ellis, I apologize for not having seen your chat sooner. I think it also loops back to creating that culture of academic integrity, which people have been talking about since I've been here, but I've very rarely seen in that broad-based way enacted since I've been here. I'm sorry to sound cynical, but this is true. So what an ideal scenario would look like, Ellis, I think, would be not necessarily, because policies are just policies. They're not practice. They're not implementation. So let the general CUNY policy give us something to be going on with. Let the college take it to start crafting out more finely tuned, given our orientation, our students, what we know about our students. Then let it go to the departments and the disciplines to fine tune it from there, so that, I know in some departments, there are a lot, Judy Lynn, I know in your department, for example, there have been a lot of group conversations amongst your full-time faculty about what your stance is. That's not true for every department. And I'm not slamming anyone for that. So sometimes instructors are left to craft it completely on their own. There isn't a mechanism for them to talk to each other. In the old days, when I was not split so dramatically between two very different roles, I used to go to one disciplinary, one departmental meeting per year for every department, and just let them ask me about that. I know that was in the good old days when I could do those things. That's not practical anymore. But what I can tell you, this is a very backwards way of addressing your concern, Ellis, and I apologize. But what does give me hope is that I have been, because there's such renewed interest in academic integrity and all its permutations now, I have been having some conversations with folks like Dean Sidman, Andrew Sidman, and whatnot. And we are talking together about the ways in which our John Jay process for dealing with academic integrity could reflect more of a departmental and disciplinary involvement, so that the dealings with them on that level could be more informed and more targeted. Because that's why, for example, using your own example very quickly, no one from the math department ever reported anything to me for years and years and years and years. I got 4 in the first 8 years I was here, reports from the math department. During the pandemic, I can't tell you how many. There's suddenly a presence on my radar, and that was out of desperation. And they're very often very frustrated because the kinds of ways I might construct cheating for a humanities-driven department doesn't work for an evidence-based, fact, it's either right or it's wrong kind of discipline like math. So yeah, these are conversations that have to go on, and maybe this current climate of emergency will push us where we need to go to have them. That's my hope.
Mm-hmm.
I see we're getting a 5-minute warning. Actually, it's like a 4-minute warning.
Now it's 2 minutes, I think, according to my clock.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
does anyone have any final questions or comments?
Will we be able to get a copy of this presentation?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's being recorded. I understand it's going to be shared shortly.
Okay.
Happy to send you the PowerPoints if it's helpful. We really use them selfishly for our own placeholder, right, ladies?
Yeah.
But happy to share. And
Well, I have sort of a melodramatic ending that I could share, which I just have in my notes here, which is, our title of our thingy is called Why Does It Matter? And in this context, we've been thinking about, why does academic integrity matter? But I feel like it's what we're also talking about, why does learning and knowledge matter? Because they are synonymous. And I think that's the point that we need to get across to students. And I think, Jennifer, you used the word culture, or maybe culture shift or something. And I think that does need to happen. It's always needed to happen, but we're kind of at a crisis point now, for a number of reasons.
yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true. Okay, then.
Thank
Well,
you, everyone.
I think hello.
That was great. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. It's now 3:00 now, so we appreciate you spending the last hour with us here. It was a great conversation. Everything is being recorded and will be sent to you via the TLC, Teaching and Learning Center.
Right.
And probably over the next couple of days. But if you have any questions, feel free to email them or any of the co-hosts. So again, thank you so much for attending this great session.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Great talk. Take care, everyone.
Bye.